Welcome to lecture 3 of social influence, and we're going to be focusing on independent behaviour, and we're going to be using these key studies here. So again, we're not really learning too much new stuff, just Ash's variation studies and Milgram's variation studies and Allen, Levine, Kohlberg, Twenge et al. So what they want you to know is independent behaviour in conformity. So what have we learnt about inconformity, about how people can now display independent behaviour, because we don't want people just to conform in life. We want people to be able to do things independently for themselves. So here is where we use Ash's variation studies. So I've just used one variation study, and that's absolutely enough. And we learn from one of these variation studies that how that role of social support. So when Ash done exactly the same study, but in this time he included another person who did not conform to the majority, yeah, or the group norm, and they found that conformity rates actually decreased. So we can say in order to increase independent behavior in conformity, we need to have social support. And this is to ensure that we feel that somebody else is backing us up. So we're less likely to conform. So social support helps increase independent behavior in conformity. And we've learned this through Ash's variation study. We could have a supporting study as well, Allen and Levine. And what they've done as well, they've done an Ash type experiment, but they had three conditions. So condition one, they had a supporter, yeah, so somebody who had social support had really, really bad vision. And how do they knew that person had bad vision? Well, they had really thick goggly glasses. And they call this condition the invalid social support. So even though somebody else was not conforming, we can call it invalid because they had bad vision. So somebody could be like, oh wow, I'm not sure about this person, maybe they're not seeing correctly. Condition two, the supporter had normal vision, and they call this the valid social support. And condition three, a bit like the normal Ash experiment, there was no support at all. And they found that condition one and two reduced the amount of conformity, obviously more so in condition two when the supporter had normal vision. This now tells us how important social support is in increasing independent behavior in conformity. So being able to resist conformity by having that social support. And again, just with evaluations, we can evaluate this Ash's study with lab experiments being mundane realism. That is, they're looking at lines. Lines really isn't a day-to-day task that we're going to be doing. It's a very artificial type task. So people may have not taken it so seriously. But strength, it was done in a lab again. Higher control, so we've kind of eliminated all sorts of extraneous variables that are variables that may get in the way of the original experiment. This is how we are able to resist pressures to obey. Again, how we increase our independent behavior, but this time in obedience. And again, what I've used here is Milgram's variation study. And this is where Milgram done exactly the same experiment, but they took it to a downtown office block. And they found that moving away from Yale University, people were more able to resist obedience. So obedience levels went down. So we can say that in order to increase independent behavior when it comes to obedience, we basically need to be more aware of the status and our environment. So if we're in a high status kind of environment, we're more likely to obey than if we're somewhere which has no kind of status. Yeah, so status slash environment increases independent behavior. And this is just an evaluation from Kohlberg. We call Kohlberg our moral guy, Lawrence Kohlberg. And what Kohlberg done is he took Milgram's volunteers and he gave them different types of dilemmas. For example, what would you do if somebody got arrested and you knew that it wasn't their fault, that it was your next door neighbor's fault, for example? And they found that people that had general moral principles, that is, they fight for justice, that I would go and tell the police that it was my next door neighbor, it wasn't that person that whatever that killed 10 people on the street. Yeah, these people that had these moral principles were more able to resist in Milgram's study than those with very, very restricted moral principles. That is, they don't care. They'll be like, oh well, it's his fault. Next door neighbor just gets off basically. Yeah, so those that don't fight for justice and all that kind of stuff. So it's a kind of way of evaluation, just in terms of, it may not just be our status environment, it may just be that people have different morals in terms of their independent behavior. So we all have different morals. That's a nice one you can use as well for evaluation. And then finally, we have independent behavior and personality, and they call this locus of control. And what we really mean by locus of control is our perception over how much control we have over our lives. And locus of control is measured on a dimension, yeah, from where you have high externals being on one end and high internals being on another end. So you have people in the middle, for example. You can have just high, very high, low, etc., and go down and that go down the dimension or the line. So people who are high externals, who have this type of personality, anything that they do or any kind of circumstance or situation they find themselves in is always based to do with outside factors. For example, I did not do so well in my examination. It's because my teacher did not teach me what she needed to, or what he needed to, or what they needed to. Yeah, so everything else is always blaming other factors. Or I done very well in my examinations because it was luck. Yes, it's all down to luck, all down to what is happening in a particular circumstances outside. Whereas high internals are people who take responsibility for their own actions, and they feel they have personal control and responsibility over their own life. So, for example, a person may say, I passed my examinations because I worked hard at my exams, or I passed my driving test because I practiced every single day for 6 months and I put in the work. So they have control over what happens to them in life. Nothing is by luck. It's all to do from them. It's all to do for themselves. And psychologists believe that people who have this type of personality, who are high internals, are more likely to be able to resist the pressures of social influence. That is, whether it be obeying or conformity, because they believe that they have control to change things. So if they were in a Milgram's experiment, for example, they'll be like, no, because it's my fault if that person hurts themselves, and it will be my issue, my problem, not yours. Whereas high externals will be like, well, I was told to do it, and he's a researcher and he has a status, therefore he's going to take all the blame. Where high internals will put the blame on themselves. So people with this type of personality, high internals, we like them because they're really much able to resist certain things like this. Okay, and we can have some evidence from Twenjatel, and they looked at a meta-analysis, which is a combination of different types of psychological studies to find an overall conclusion, and they found that young Americans were becoming more external in terms of, this was done in 2004, remember, so they tended to focus on external factors influencing their life. And people who are externals, they're more likely, or it's been associated with them having poorer school achievement, decreased self-control and depression, because they feel that they can't change their situation, so they kind of like go into themselves and get depressed about everything. So again, high internals are the ones that we like, the personality which are not a bit better, but the personalities who are able to resist these kind of things. And that is the end of lecture 3. Again, do go back and look at the 3 ways in how we can increase our independent behavior. So the first one is social support, second one is status environment, and the third one is a type of personality that we have. Our next lecture, we're going to be looking at typical examination questions, looking at independent behavior and resisting pressures to conform and obey.